Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In today's lesson, we're going to go through the second slides on humanism. We start off with the poet Horace, who was well known for his criticism on poetry as well as for his poems. He was born Quintus Horatius Flaccus or Horace, and he was the best known poet for writing satires and lyric odes. His major work is Ars Poetica, and he believed in the idea of dulce et utile, in the sense that his poems must be didactic tools as well as provide pleasure for his audience. So, the pleasure of poetry for Horace makes it popular and accessible, and its lesson can be understood by many. He also argued that poets can imitate other artists and not just nature. He established the importance of poet knowing literary tradition, respecting conventions, and creating new forms of poetry. To this day, his influence is felt in the sense that in order to become a poet, one potential poet should know about the forms of poetry that are available in this world. If you want to write a pantun, for example, you have to know that we have two lines that are called pembayang and two lines that carry the meaning of the poems. So the idea that a poet must know that there are rules in writing poetry was brought about by Horace. The second poet to appear on the scene is Plotinus, who was born in 204 CE and died sometime in 270. And he brought about the idea of Neoplatonism. Now, he's generally the founder of Neoplatonism. Plotinus was born in Lycopolis, Egypt, in 204 CE and studied philosophy at Alexandria or Iskandaria in today's Egypt, and joined the Roman army before making his way to Rome in 245, and then lecturing there until his death. So he was, in every sense of the word, an Egyptian. So the term Neoplatonism is an invention of early 19th century European scholarship and indicates his penchant for dividing history in terms of period. So this was um, the way 19th century European looked at history. Yeah? And neo basically means new, and new Platonism means basically that Plotinus was influenced by the idea of Plato. And he wanted to popularize Plato's idea and also provide a reinterpretation of the poet's work. Neoplatonism consists of the world as an emanation from an ultimate indivisible being with whom the soul is capable of being reunited in trance or ecstasy. So, Platonism, uh, Neoplatonism, yeah, believes that this world is an emanation from God, that everything in this world carries with it an essence of God. So we are capable, according to the Neoplatonists, of being reunited with this God who had, according to them, given his soul, parts of his soul to us as his creator. So we are, his its creation or his creation are able to be reunited with this God by contemplating and then finally reaching trance or ecstasy. Neoplatonism postulated an all sufficient unity, the one from whom emanated the divine mind, and below that the world soul. So, um, Neoplatonism believed in uh, the divine mind and the world soul. The divine mind is belongs to God, yeah, and the world soul is belonging to the things that we have in this world. So basically, what Neoplatonism believes in is that we can become united with God through some kind of mystical union, yeah, with Him, through contemplation, through thinking about it. And this is similar to what Plato said, that in order to know about the ideal world, that we can just contemplate on it. Now, some thinkers argue that Neoplatonism and other Greek philosophies became popular in Muslim countries during the 8th CE and until 12th CE. So the Sufis, for example, propagate the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud or Unitism that states that man dissolves his ego or existence in the essence of God. He is just a drop of water that slips into the sea and loses its individuality. Similarity to Neoplatonism because uh, it believes that man can become united with God through contemplation and then becoming a part of the existence of creation. Now, this has become a source of controversy for some other Muslims because it could lead to the neglect of practicing compulsory rituals in religion, such as praying. So, Muhammad Iqbal, the famous poet from Pakistan, advanced his idea of pana and separation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and man. So to him, we cannot think, Muslims cannot think, and poets as well cannot think that we can become united with God um, in any way, you know, because we are both separate creations, and therefore man has to pray to God because he is separate from him. The points of both Sufis and Muhammad Iqbal reflect their different beliefs. After uh, Horace and the Neoplatonists, there appeared another set of critics, and this belonged to the Renaissance period. During the Renaissance time, there was an explosion of art, literature, and science from the 14th until the 16th centuries. It witnessed the purpose, form, and importance of literature being propagated everywhere in Europe. Now, the Renaissance discourse on literary theory was stimulated at least by the rediscovery of Aristotle's Poetics, a text lost to Western culture during the Dark Ages. So, as mentioned in the very first slide, the Renaissance thinkers um, gained inspiration from the early writings of Aristotle and Plato. During the Renaissance era, we have figures like Sir Philip Sidney, who was born in 1554 and died in 1586. There was no contribution in English literature and English criticism until Sidney came along. His major work is An Apology for Poetry, which was published in 1583. It is a defense of poetic art because at that time it was under the attack of a Puritan critic who argued that poetry is a waste of time based on lies and taught sinful things. Puritanism, as we all know, is a denomination in Protestantism. So, to the Puritans, any form of um, pleasurable experience or things that could cause pleasure is a form of sin. Okay. So they viewed themselves as being pure from all types of sinful things. So poetry was considered as um, causing sin and causing the poet to commit sin, yeah, because it brought pleasure to the listeners and also to the poet. So the Puritan critic here criticized poetry on along those lines. Sidney follows Horace by arguing that poetry provides pleasure and educates at the same time. So Sidney, when he wrote an apology for uh, poetry or a defense of poetry, he was trying to counter-react against the allegations made by the Puritan critic. Regarding accusations that poetry is the mother of lies, he follows Aristotle's arguments, and that he says that the mimetic quality of poetry, rather than presenting an inferior world, in effect presents a high level of reality. The speaking picture tells us forms of truth that would be unavailable to raw observation. So what he says is um, art and poetry, in that sense, can improve on nature, or maybe um, complements it by focusing and allowing the reader and poet also to focus on a certain experience, yeah? And this would be able to produce new information for the speaker as well as the listener, and more information as well as the truth about the matter, okay, because there is an in-depth focus on certain subjects in poems. The poet's imagination, unchained by limitations of sensory experience, can create realities not yet shown in reality. It can also produce something new. Um, it is not tied to natural laws because poetry can create feigned history, which is not dangerous and can even speak to human soul, not just our reason. So this is another way poetry can improve on nature, because to Sidney and others, it can create something new, a faint history. And this faint means something that is man made. So it could be that in poems, one can create a satire about the political situation in one's country, for example, or any type of commentaries that would be deemed unlawful in real life. So poetry can speak to the human soul, um, to tell others about meanings that would sometimes be censored or considered to be inappropriate um, for human speech or daily speech. Sidney says that poetry has some participation of the divine by showing man the desires of his mind, just as soul is greater than the world, poetry is greater than the material world. Yeah. So he says that poetry is able to show your desire. After all, it is an exploration of your inner yearnings and urgings and desires for something. So in poetry, man learns about his true self, according to uh, Sydney. And you would find poems, for example, love poems, yeah, which can be written in many lines expressing the love that one person, the poet, has for another, or an object of his desire. And through these lines, you learn more about the quality of love that the poet has for the subject. So, more than that, poetry can alter the way we comprehend something, unlike reason, which can perceive and understand it. So, what it says is that we can also understand something more deeply in poetry, because we put into it our emotion, and not only emotion that is being written in the lines of a poem, but it's also being read from the reader, and from him, from the reader, we get an emotional response also to lines of poetry. The second person in the slide today is Joseph Addison. He lived in the after the Romantic period, sometime after the Romantic period. So, in On the Pleasures of the Imagination, Addison explores the question of how poetry creates pleasure. Um, so he also, as uh, he lived. Yeah, I'm sorry about the earlier information. He did not live after the Romantic period. He lived before the Romantic period, but after the Renaissance. So In On the Pleasures of the Imagination, Addison explores the question of how poetry creates pleasure. He follows Plato because he's concerned about how people are affected by poems, but is more concerned about the aesthetic effect rather than the moral one. So he was concerned with what we term as taste. He is interested in how poetry can delight rather than just instruct. And Addison described two kinds of pleasures: primary pleasures, which is an immediate experience of objects through primary perceptions, and secondary pleasure, which is an experience of ideas from secondary objects, words, or pictures when the subjects are not directly present. So, primary pleasures is something that you gain when you observe an object close enough, to um, get some kind of feeling about it. For example, when you look at a rose, for example, um, so most people would love to see a rose, and because it smells very nice and it looks very beautiful and so on. So secondary pleasure is uh, when you experience pleasure after looking at a secondary object that represents the thing that is considered beautiful. For example, a picture of a rose. If you have on your hand a picture of the rose, you also get some kind of pleasure even though the subject is not present. Imagination is less refined than reason. It provides pleasure from the observation of the obvious rather than probing hidden causes and effects. Thus, primary pleasure is easier to acquire than secondary pleasure. So, imagination, according to Addison, um, allows one to gain pleasure from um, holding a rose. Because in one's mind, perhaps this nice smell of the rose will conjure up memories of um, being loved or being happy. So it is providing immediate pleasure. Now, when a person who is not knowledgeable in art, for example, um, looks at a rose, that person can feel immediate pleasure from looking at the rose. So it is easier to acquire than secondary pleasure. Primary pleasure is easier to acquire than secondary pleasure. Um, Looking at the secondary pleasure is one pleasure, the feeling of pleasure that one gets by looking at a picture of rose. Now, this kind of pleasure would require one to have some knowledge about how a rose is painted. So maybe a particular color is being used to paint the rose. Maybe there are strokes of or you can say brush strokes that are being used by the painter to paint the rose. So the only way a person can really truly appreciate the picture of the rose, according to Addison, is when he has knowledge about how the painting is produced, what kind of strokes, complex strokes are being used by the author, what kind of beautiful color uh, that being used by the author, and so on. Now, this secondary pleasure is harder to attain because it requires some kind of knowledge on the part of the person who is experiencing the pleasure. Okay, so what is also not an inferior imitation of what but complements it? Now, according to Addison, art is not an inferior imitation of nature but complements it. So it's looking at the different ways in which we experience pleasure through nature and through art. But it says that um, neither art nor nature is secondary to the other. Addison points out that secondary pleasure of imagination makes it possible for an experience which could be disagreeable in reality to be represented in agreeable forms. So maybe if you were to paint an old lady, for example, and the old lady might be disagreeable in reality because you can see the lines on her face and so on, and she may be crying in pain and so on. But when you see her in the form of a picture, yeah, sometimes we can gain pleasure because we can see that the painter has been very, very uh, talented, no? Eh, in or can be very skillful at portraying the lady. The danger of art in this logic lies in its premise that art is more superior than reality, though Addison cannot explain why mimesis is itself pleasurable. So, when you have art being um, equal to reality or to nature, there is also the danger of making art more superior because while nature itself is disagreeable, art can make it into something that is agreeable. And hence, art can be a form of deception or illusion. The next person in Lyricism is Edmund Burke. In a philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, Burke disagrees with Plato's idea that art is merely a copy of nature. Burke suggested that art should be accessed not through how it approximates nature, but be based on the idea of taste, its conception of what one wants a representation to do. So he believed in the idea of taste. Because he disagrees with Plato's idea that art is merely a copy of nature. So art represents for him the different tastes that we have. For example, a shoemaker may want an accurate picture of a shoe, while a dancer may want a picture that gives a sense of the shoe's motion and liveliness. Taste is an emotional quality, according to him, rather than a physical one. So for Burke, art is not a copy of nature, but should be about individual taste. So art is simply people's taste of subjects that could be found on this earth. It is not in any way inferior or even trying to copy nature. And hence, when sometimes we get many types of pictures that are slightly different from each other when they are using, when the painters, for at least, are using different types of painting, um, and they could be about the same subject, but the pictures are slightly different from each other. So, the last person in this slide is Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson essays, Samuel Johnson's essay in The Rambler marks the beginning of lyricism of novels. Like poetry and drama, novels depend on presenting stories that imitate nature. However, novels depends on the principle of realism, which is strictly to present the world as it really is to readers. It achieves this through mimesis. Johnson follows Plato in insisting that criticism on literature has to be based on whether it teaches human beings to behave better or not. Good art, in his view, is art that has a positive moral message. Bad art has a bad message. According to Johnson, novels could be more harmful than poetry because novels have a more realistic form, thus more believed for descriptions of real life. What are often read by the young and the ignorant, Johnson warns, and have the power to lodge ideas firmly in uninformed minds. So novelists must care to choose their subjects matter. So the novels are or novels are often read by the young and ignorant. So he is Samuel Johnson is like Plato in the sense that he is the father of literary criticism, but of novels of a specific genre in literature. He is the first to criticize novels. The rule of presenting reality should be bent, according to Johnson, so that novels that deviate from nature, which, when it is necessary to present the proper outcome, where uh, the bad behaviors or a bad behavior is punished and a good behavior is rewarded. So Johnson believed in poetic uh, license and poetic justice. Johnson argues that ancient Greek and Roman writers presented the best models of literary art. These works have withstood the test of time and have been very useful for generations of readers, so any writer must have a thorough knowledge of the classical tradition. So, even though he believed that novels um, can have an influence on the behaviors of its readers or their readers, he also argues that Greek and Roman writers presented the best models of literary art. So he wasn't like Plato in the sense that uh, he saw something good and in the plays and epics by Greek and Roman writers. Even though he said that um, when people read novels, they should pay attention to the moral lesson being taught. Okay, so that is all for today. Thank you for listening.